In the grand theatre of the British monarchy, few figures have embodied the tragic arc of classical drama as completely as Princess Margaret Rose. Born into the gilded cage of royalty, she lived a life that would have made Shakespeare himself weep. A tale of promise unfulfilled, love thwarted, and a spirit slowly crushed beneath the weight of duty and public expectation. Her story reads like a royal King Lear, where the protagonist's flaws and circumstances conspire to create a devastating downfall, or perhaps more aptly, a feminine Hamlet, trapped between desire and obligation, ultimately destroyed by the very forces that should have protected her. Margaret's life unfolded across the tumultuous decades of the 20th century, from the rigid formality of the pre-war era through the swinging 60s and into the harsh spotlight of modern celebrity culture. She was at once the most glamorous and the most tragic member of the House of Windsor, a woman whose every attempt to find happiness seemed doomed by the collision between her passionate nature and the cold machinery of royal protocol. Princess Margaret Rose was born on August 21, 1930, the second daughter of the Duke and Duchess of York, later King George VI and Queen Elizabeth. From the moment she drew breath, she was destined to play second fiddle to her elder sister Elizabeth. Yet in those early years, Margaret shone with a particular brilliance that seemed to promise a life of extraordinary fulfillment. Unlike her serious, dutiful sister, Margaret possessed an effervescent personality that captivated all who encountered her. She was witty, vivacious, and possessed of a natural theatrical flair that made her the star of any gathering. Her beauty was of a different order than Elizabeth's, more sultry, more immediately compelling. Where Elizabeth embodied the steady virtues of duty and service, Margaret radiated the dangerous allure of passion and spontaneity. The abdication crisis of 1936 transformed the family's destiny overnight. Suddenly, Uncle David's abandonment of the throne for love thrust Margaret's father into kingship and her sister into the role of heir presumptive. Margaret found herself in the peculiar position of being both essential to the monarchy's future and utterly superfluous to its function. This contradiction would define her entire existence, always in the spotlight, never at its center, always needed for appearances, never needed for purpose. During the war years, Margaret's personality began to crystallize into the form it would maintain throughout her life. She developed a love of performance, particularly music and dance, that went far beyond mere royal accomplishment. She could play the piano with genuine skill, possessed a lovely singing voice, and moved with the grace of a professional performer. More tellingly, she began to display the sharp wit and occasional cruelty that would become her trademark. Even as a teenager, she had the ability to deliver cutting observations that could devastate with surgical precision. The young Margaret was also developing what would become a lifelong talent for attracting interesting, creative people. She gravitated toward artists, writers, and musicians with an instinct that seemed to recognize kindred spirits. This attraction to the bohemian world would later become one of her defining characteristics, but in these early years, it simply marked her as someone with exceptional taste and an appreciation for genuine talent. The first great tragedy of Margaret's life played out with all the inexorable force of classical drama. Group Captain Peter Townsend, a decorated war hero and equerry to her father, entered her life as a stable, mature presence during the turbulent war years. 16 years her senior, divorced, and decidedly not royal, Townsend represented everything that Margaret's position theoretically forbade her to have, yet everything her heart desperately wanted. Their love affair unfolded slowly, naturally, and with devastating inevitability. By the early 1950s, the princess and the equerry had fallen deeply in love, their relationship conducted with discretion but growing intensity. For Margaret, Townsend represented not just romantic love, but the possibility of a life lived authentically, free from the suffocating constraints of royal protocol. The crisis came to a head in 1955, when Margaret was forced to choose between love and duty. The Church of England, of which her sister was now supreme governor, did not recognize divorce. The government, led by Prime Minister Anthony Eden, himself divorced and remarried, advised against the match. The press, initially sympathetic, began to turn against the romance as its impossibility became clear. Margaret's decision to renounce Townsend was announced in a statement that read like a suicide note. "I have decided not to marry Group Captain Townsend. I have been conscious that subject to my renouncing my rights of succession, it might have been possible for me to contract a civil marriage. But mindful of the Church's teachings that Christian marriage is indissoluble and conscious of my duty to the Commonwealth, I have resolved to put these considerations before others." The sacrifice was complete, noble, and utterly devastating. In choosing duty over love, Margaret had preserved the monarchy's moral authority while destroying her own chance at happiness. The decision would haunt her for the rest of her life, creating a wound that never fully healed. Years later, she would tell friends that she had made the right choice, but the bitterness in her voice suggested otherwise. In 1960, Margaret married photographer Anthony Armstrong Jones, later created Earl of Snowden. The match seemed perfect on paper. He was talented, charming, and moved in the same artistic circles that Margaret found so appealing. He was also, crucially, not divorced and therefore acceptable to the establishment. The wedding was a spectacle of joy and optimism, broadcast to millions and seeming to herald a new chapter in Margaret's life. Initially, the marriage appeared to be a success. Snowden brought a breath of fresh air to the stuffy world of royal protocol, and Margaret seemed to bloom under his influence. They moved in fashionable circles, entertaining artists, actors, and writers at their home in Kensington Palace. Their children, David and Sarah, were born in 1961 and 1964, respectively, and for a time, it seemed that Margaret had found her perfect life. However, the marriage contained the seeds of its own destruction. Both Margaret and Snowden were strong-willed, creative personalities who needed to be the center of attention. They were also both prone to infidelity, with Snowden's affairs becoming increasingly blatant and Margaret's own wandering eye leading to several passionate relationships. The photographer's middle-class background meant he never fully understood or accepted the constraints of royal life, while Margaret's position meant she could never fully escape those constraints. The couple's rows became legendary among their social circle. Margaret's temper, always formidable, found its match in Snowden's cruel wit and deliberate provocations. Friends would describe dinner parties that devolved into vicious arguments, with both partners wielding their considerable verbal skills like weapons. The marriage became a performance of mutual destruction, played out before an audience of London's cultural elite. By the late 1960s, the marriage was effectively over in all but name. They maintained separate social circles, took separate holidays, and conducted their affairs with increasing openness. The final blow came when Margaret discovered that Snowden had been having a serious affair with Lady Jacqueline Rufus Isaacs, the daughter of the Marquess of Reading. The divorce was finalized in 1978, making Margaret the first senior royal to divorce since Henry VIII. The 1970s marked the beginning of Margaret's most notorious period. Having lost her marriage and never recovered from the loss of Townsend, she threw herself into a lifestyle that scandalized the British public and delighted the international press. Her retreat to the Caribbean island of Mustique became the stuff of legend, a tropical stage where she could play out her fantasies of liberation from royal constraints. Mustique, a private island owned by her friend Colin Tennant, later Lord Glenconner, became Margaret's sanctuary and her downfall. There, surrounded by a carefully curated group of artists, writers, and social figures, she could indulge in behaviors that would have been impossible in Britain. The island's isolation and Tennant's protection created a bubble where royal protocol ceased to exist, replaced by a hedonistic lifestyle that centered around elaborate parties, heavy drinking, and increasingly desperate attempts to recapture her lost youth. The princess's Mustique circle read like a who's who of creative talent and social outcasts. Writers like Gore Vidal and Truman Capote, artists like Derek Hill, and a rotating cast of young men who served as escorts and companions. These relationships were often intense, but ultimately shallow, built on Margaret's need for constant attention and her companion's fascination with royal proximity. Her behavior during this period became increasingly erratic and self-destructive. She would hold court at beach bars, demanding attention and becoming petulant when it was not forthcoming. Her drinking, always a problem, became more serious, and she developed a reputation for cruel behavior toward staff and perceived slights toward herself. The woman who had once been celebrated for her wit and charm was increasingly seen as a pathetic figure, desperately clinging to a lifestyle that emphasized her irrelevance rather than her importance. The most notorious relationship of this period was with Roddy Llewellyn, a landscape gardener 17 years her junior. Their affair, conducted openly on Mustique and increasingly in Britain, provided the press with endless material for scandal. Llewellyn was handsome, charming, and utterly unsuitable, exactly the sort of man who would have been perfect for Margaret had she been anyone other than who she was. The 1980s brought no relief from Margaret's downward spiral. Her health began to deteriorate, exacerbated by years of heavy smoking and drinking. She suffered from depression, which she never acknowledged publicly, but which was apparent to those around her. The death of her father in 1952 had been a devastating blow, but the loss of her mother in 1985 removed the last restraining influence on her behavior. The British press, which had once treated her with deference and affection, became increasingly hostile. Her lifestyle was contrasted unfavorably with the emerging star of the royal family, Diana, Princess of Wales, whose youth and apparent dedication to duty made Margaret seem even more irrelevant and dissolute. The emergence of the tabloid press meant that every aspect of her life was subjected to scrutiny and criticism. Margaret's public appearances became exercises in damage control. She would arrive at events looking tired and often unwell, her famous beauty faded and her charm replaced by a brittle defensiveness. Her speeches, once noted for their wit and intelligence, became rambling and sometimes incoherent. The transformation from the glamorous princess of the 1950s to the tragic figure of the 1980s was complete and heartbreaking. Her relationship with her sister Elizabeth became increasingly strained during this period. The Queen, always dutiful and controlled, found it difficult to understand or tolerate Margaret's behavior. While she continued to support her sister financially and emotionally, there was a growing distance between them that reflected their fundamentally different approaches to royal duty. The final act of Margaret's decline played out in the 1990s and early 2000s. A series of strokes left her partially paralyzed and increasingly dependent on others. The woman who had once been the most vivacious member of the royal family was reduced to a wheelchair-bound figure, her famous voice reduced to a whisper, her sharp wit dulled by medication and illness. Throughout her public life, Margaret maintained a facade of glamour and confidence that masked profound sadness and insecurity. Those who knew her well described a woman who was deeply unhappy, constantly seeking validation and affection, but never finding the genuine love she craved. Her relationships were marked by a pattern of passionate beginnings, followed by bitter endings, as if she were doomed to repeat the trauma of her loss of Peter Townsend. Her alcoholism, while never officially acknowledged, was an open secret among her friends and family. She used alcohol to numb the pain of her circumstances, but it also contributed to her erratic behavior and declining health. The bottle became both her companion and her destroyer, offering temporary relief from the prison of her birth, but ultimately making that prison even more confining. Margaret's relationship with her royal duties was equally complicated. She performed her ceremonial functions with competence, but without enthusiasm, seeing them as burdens rather than privileges. Unlike her sister, who found meaning and purpose in service, Margaret saw duty as a series of obligations that prevented her from living authentically. This fundamental conflict between personal desire and public expectation created a tension that she never resolved. The tragedy of Margaret's life was that she possessed genuine talents and intelligence that were never fully utilized. In a different era or different circumstances, she might have been a successful actress, singer, or writer. Instead, she was trapped in a role that required her to be ornamental rather than functional, decorative rather than creative. Princess Margaret died on February 9, 2002, at the age of 71, her death coinciding with the 50th anniversary of her father's death and her sister's accession to the throne. The timing seemed almost deliberately symbolic, as if even in death she remained in the shadow of more significant events. Her funeral was a small, private affair, in stark contrast to the grand spectacle of her wedding 42 years earlier. The congregation was filled with the survivors of her bohemian circle, aging artists and writers who had shared her journey from glamour to tragedy. The service was a subdued affair, marked more by relief than grief, as if everyone present understood that death had finally freed her from a life that had become unbearable. The assessment of Margaret's life in the immediate aftermath of her death was largely negative. She was remembered as a cautionary tale about the dangers of royal privilege without purpose, a woman who had squandered her advantages and brought shame upon the institution that had protected her. The press coverage was respectful, but not particularly sympathetic, focusing on her decline rather than her early promise. However, with the passage of time, a more nuanced understanding of Margaret's tragedy has emerged. Modern observers recognize that she was caught between two worlds, the rigid duty-bound world of her birth and the liberating creative world she yearned to inhabit. Her failure to find happiness was not simply a matter of personal weakness, but a consequence of circumstances that would have challenged anyone. In the context of Shakespeare's tragic heroes, Margaret most closely resembles Hamlet, a character of exceptional intelligence and sensitivity who is destroyed by the impossible demands of his situation. Like Hamlet, she was trapped between conflicting obligations, unable to act decisively because every choice led to loss. Her madness, like his, was both real and performed, a response to circumstances that offered no satisfactory resolution. Princess Margaret's legacy is complex and contradictory. She is remembered as both a cautionary tale and a tragic figure, a woman who represented both the glamour and the emptiness of royal life. Her story serves as a reminder of the human cost of institutional demands and the price of sacrificing personal happiness for public duty. In the broader context of royal history, Margaret's life marked a turning point in the relationship between the monarchy and the public. Her affairs and scandals helped to humanize the royal family, showing that even princesses could be flawed and unhappy. This humanization was both a blessing and a curse, making the royals more relatable but also more vulnerable to criticism. Her influence on subsequent generations of royals is evident in the lives of her nephews and their wives, who have struggled with many of the same tensions between personal desires and public expectations. The lessons of Margaret's life, particularly the importance of finding meaningful purpose and the dangers of public scrutiny, continue to resonate within the royal family. Perhaps most importantly, Margaret's story serves as a reminder of the importance of individual agency and the tragic consequences of denying people the right to choose their own paths. Her life was shaped by forces beyond her control, but her response to those forces, alternating between rebellion and submission, created a tragedy that was both personal and universal. In the end, Princess Margaret remains one of the most fascinating and tragic figures in modern royal history. Her life reads like a classical tragedy, complete with fatal flaws, impossible choices, and inevitable downfall. She was a woman of extraordinary potential who was ultimately destroyed by the very forces that created her, a Shakespearean heroine trapped in the wrong century, forever reaching for a happiness that remained perpetually beyond her grasp. The glamour that surrounded her public life was real, but ultimately hollow, a beautiful performance that concealed profound sadness and unfulfilled longing. Her story reminds us that even those who seem to have everything can be the most tragic figures of all, prisoners of their own circumstances and victims of their own desires. In the grand theatre of the British monarchy, Princess Margaret played her role with style and grace, but it was always a role she had not chosen. In a play she could not escape, with an ending that was written long before she ever stepped onto the stage.